It was supposed to be an easy job, babysitting an old woman in her big, isolated house for a few nights while her family went on vacation. But the first night, I saw something through the window, and it made me question if I was truly alone. I had just turned 18, and I was eager to get some experience as a caregiver. I'd always enjoyed helping people, and when I saw an ad for a live-in babysitting job for an elderly woman, I jumped at the opportunity. The family promised a good paycheck in exchange for looking after their grandmother for a few nights while they went on vacation. The woman, Mrs. Calloway, lived in a massive house on the outskirts of town, an old Victorian mansion that always looked like something out of a horror movie. It was isolated, surrounded by thick woods on all sides, with no neighbors for miles. When I arrived at the house, Mrs. Calloway seemed sweet but frail. She was in her late 80s, with a sharp, piercing gaze that made her seem much younger than she actually was. Her skin was pale, and her voice was soft, almost a whisper. She told me she didn't need much care, just someone to sit with her and make sure she didn't fall. Her family was leaving for a few days, and I'd be alone with her in this big, creaky house. The first night was uneventful. Mrs. Calloway was quiet, mostly sleeping in her armchair by the fireplace while I watched TV. As the night wore on, I couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of unease. The house was cold despite the fire crackling in the hearth, and the silence felt heavier than usual. Every so often, I'd hear a faint thump from upstairs, but I assumed it was just the house settling. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. Mrs. Calloway was asleep, and I felt an overwhelming sense of tiredness. The house was dark, save for a small lamp in the hallway. But as I walked down the hallway to my room, something caught my eye. I glanced out the window. Nothing unusual, just the thick blackness of the woods. Then, I saw something that made my heart stop. Through the trees, there was a faint figure, a silhouette of a person standing in the yard, staring at the house. I froze, staring at the figure. It was too far away for me to make out details, but the person was standing unnaturally still, not moving a muscle. I quickly dismissed it, telling myself it was just a trick of the light or a branch swaying in the wind. But then, the figure took a step forward, and then another, slowly, deliberately, until it was standing directly beneath the window. I ducked down, trying not to make a sound. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath shallow. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but the figure didn't move. Finally, I mustered the courage to peek through the curtains. To my shock, the yard was empty. I tried to brush it off. I convinced myself it was a figment of my imagination, or perhaps someone walking through the woods. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, I told Mrs. Calloway about what I'd seen, but she only smiled gently and said, "Don't worry, dear. The house does strange things sometimes." Her cryptic answer did nothing to ease my nerves. That night, I heard the thumps again, this time louder and closer. It sounded like footsteps, dragging across the floor upstairs. I could feel my skin crawl, my eyes darting to the stairs at the end of the hallway. I gathered my courage and slowly made my way up. When I reached the top, I noticed Mrs. Calloway's door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open quietly, and there she was, sitting in the corner of her room, staring at the wall. She hadn't even acknowledged my presence. "Mrs. Calloway?" I asked cautiously. Her head snapped around, and for the first time, I saw something in her eyes, something dark. "He's here," she whispered. "He always comes back when they leave." Confused and uneasy, I tried to ask what she meant, but before I could, she suddenly stood up, her frail body moving with unnatural speed. She walked toward the window, her eyes never leaving the glass. "That's when he watches," she said in a low voice, as if to herself. "He's always watching." The air in the room seemed to freeze, and a chill ran down my spine. I turned to the window, expecting to see the familiar view of the woods. But there, standing just outside, was the same figure I had seen the night before. Only this time, he wasn't standing still. He was moving, slowly, deliberately, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes dark, hollow pits. I stumbled back, but Mrs. Calloway grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Don't look away," she hissed. "He doesn't like it when you look away." I could barely breathe, too terrified to move. The figure outside was coming closer, his movements deliberate, as if he knew we were watching him. And then, with a sudden rush of panic, I realized something. The door to the attic was open, a faint light coming from within. I had not seen it open before, but it was now wide. "Don't go up there," Mrs. Calloway whispered. "It's too late now." I didn't understand. What did she mean? Before I could ask, the house seemed to groan and shift. The figure outside stopped and turned, slowly making his way toward the attic. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps moving upstairs. And then I realized the footsteps weren't coming from the attic. They were coming from behind me. I turned slowly, dread sinking into my stomach. Mrs. Calloway's frail figure was no longer standing in front of the window. She was behind me, her eyes wide open and unblinking. "It's too late," she said, her voice no longer soft but cold and hollow. "He's here for you now." And then the room went black. I don't know what happened after that. I woke up the next morning in the front yard, no memory of how I got there. The house was eerily quiet, and Mrs. Calloway was gone. The family never returned, and the authorities found nothing when they investigated. But I know what I saw. To this day, I still hear footsteps behind me when I'm alone at night, and sometimes, just when I think I'm safe, I catch a glimpse of a shadow in the corner of my eye. I'm telling you this because I don't think I'm the only one he's watching. I thought the worst was behind me, but the nightmares began almost immediately after I left the house. It's like I couldn't escape the memory of Mrs. Calloway's eyes, the cold emptiness of her voice, and the figure that seemed to follow me even when I closed my eyes. The first night back in my own apartment, I heard the faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across the floor. It was quiet at first, almost unnoticeable, but then it grew louder, closer. I remember pulling the covers over my head, telling myself it was just the wind or a raccoon outside my window. But I knew deep down it wasn't. It felt the same as that night in the old house, the same heavy, suffocating dread. When I opened my eyes, there was a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It wasn't the same figure from Mrs. Calloway's house, but I could tell it was something similar. A tall, thin shadow, its face distorted by darkness. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I closed my eyes again, hoping that if I didn't look at it, it would go away. But the cold air in the room grew more intense, and I could feel its presence. When I opened my eyes again, it was gone. Just like that. I never told anyone about what happened. How could I? Who would believe that I saw something like that? I didn't even believe it myself at first. But the more I tried to forget, the more persistent the nightmares became. I couldn't go a night without hearing the scraping sound, without feeling eyes on me. I tried moving to a new city, a fresh start, but the same thing kept happening. In the new apartment, the figure appeared. Then again at a coffee shop, standing in the window, staring at me. It wasn't just in my dreams anymore. It was following me. It was real. And that's when I started to realize something I didn't want to accept. That figure from the house, that thing that haunted Mrs. Calloway, wasn't just a ghost or some bad dream. It was something much worse. It was a watcher, a parasite that latched onto its victims, feeding off their fear. And I was its newest prey. I thought about returning to the house, thinking that maybe if I confronted whatever it was that had been lurking there, it would leave me alone. But when I went back to the town, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. The house was gone. The lot where Mrs. Calloway's mansion had once stood was empty. There was no trace of the old building, no signs, no remnants. The land was barren, as if it had never been there in the first place. I spoke to the locals. but no one seemed to remember the house. They said there was never a house on that property, that it had always been empty land. But I remember it. I remember it too clearly, and that's when it hit me. Mrs. Calloway had known. She had known what was happening, what had happened to her, and what was coming for me. That thing in the woods, that figure, wasn't just tied to the house. It was tied to her, and now it was tied to me. I don't know how much longer I can keep running from it. I don't know if it will ever stop following me. Every shadow in the corner of my eye, every flicker of movement in the dark makes my heart race. It's still out there, watching. So if you're ever alone in a house that feels too quiet, in a room that's too still, be careful. Because you might think you're alone, but trust me, you're not. It's always watching, and it always comes back.